This last week was the AAS22 conference in Chicago. For those that don't know, AAS stands for American Association of Suicidology. So in this video, I wanted to share some of my reflections from the conference, what I learned, and what things I found to be the most impactful. This is Speak the Unspeakable, a series focused on suicide prevention through the lens of lived experience. My name is Scott Teichmer. I am a suicide preventionist and a suicide attempt survivor. So the AAS, American Association of Suicidology, and yes, that is a real word. I did not just make that up. Suicidology, simply put, is the study of suicide. The AAS was founded in 1968 by Edwin Shneidman, and the organization's mission statement is to promote the understanding and prevention of suicide and support those who have been affected by it. So pretty simply put, I attended my first AAS conference in 2019 in Denver, but I didn't become a member of AAS until last year. So membership actually offers a pretty good discount on the cost of the conference and also gives me access to the scientific journal Suicide and Life-Threatening Behavior. I'll start by sharing about some of the presentations I attended, but to be honest, some of the most impactful moments for me this last week actually happened in between sessions. Some around the breakfast table and even at an after-hours party. I'll share more on that towards the end. I took notes at the conference, so let's take a look at my notebook. The first general session that everybody attended really focused on 988. Starting July 16th, 988, a 3-digit number, will be officially launched, which will be our suicide and crisis line. Anybody in the United States should be able to call 988, kind of in a similar fashion to how we would right now call National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, or could also text 988. So it will operate via call, text, and chat. There was a lot of great information, and that was a pretty extensive presentation. So they talked about things like 988, 911 interoperability. They talked about geolocation services, a variety of topics, and it was really impressive how much federal funding is being put into this to make this happen. The next session I attended was focused on blended hearts, and really what this was about was workshops that were put on where they brought together suicide attempt survivors and survivors of suicide loss. Many communities might have a bereavement group, grief support group for survivors of suicide loss. A few communities have support groups for survivors of suicide attempt. As you know, if you've watched this channel before, I run such a group for attempt survivors. These are groups where they actually bring those people together and find profound meanings from one another. Another presentation I went to focused on military and veteran caregivers. So the family members, the supports that are there, providing that support, go through hardships themselves. So the things that we can do as communities to support them as well. And then I went to a group on virtual survivors of suicide attempt support groups. And this was focused specifically on the D.D. Hirsch model of support groups that I've talked about in the webinar, How to Start a Suicide Attempt Survivor Support Group in Your Community or Organization. That D.D. Hirsch support group is really a hybrid group that involves peer support. So there are individuals with lived experience that have been through the group that help facilitate, and then they also have a clinician that does more of the therapeutic modules. One of the more intriguing breakouts I attended focused on things like artificial intelligence, machine learning, and natural language processing. And a lot of that was a bit over my head, but was really interesting. There was another general presentation that really focused on arts as suicide prevention. An extremely profound experience I had was in the session where a taiko player, so taiko is a large drum, Japanese percussion instrument, and during the presentation, just hearing, you couldn't help but feel the drum in your body and the physicality of the taiko player, and how leading up to it had shared the story of losing his brother to suicide and kind of channeling his emotions and intensity through the drum. It was extremely impactful, and in fact, one of the highlights of the conference for me. It also really helped me to realize, I can get very stuck on, we want to utilize evidence-based practices, and so can sometimes really only give value to things that are very formalized. Then being able to take a step back and look at the emotional impact, the healing that can come from music was really eye-opening, especially for myself as an amateur musician. Another really great breakout session I went to focused on supporting preschool children through grief after a suicide loss. And that was extremely important how they went through helping teach the developmentally appropriate ways of supporting children through that. Another one of the general sessions focused on suicide in the Black male population. And there were common themes throughout many presentations where they really talked about the stigma being one of the barriers to people reaching out for help. I went to another great breakout session on suicide and substance abuse and the importance of treating co-occurring disorders rather than just treating substance use or mental illness, mental health conditions separately. It's really important to treat them together. So I got a lot of good strategies. And then the closing presentation of the conference on Saturday was focused on the nature of science and the nature of suicide. And that one was by Thomas Joyner, who many of you may know formulated the interpersonal theory of suicide, which has been one of the preeminent theories that many suicidologists and suicide preventionists talk about. Suicidology as a study is really fairly young, looking at to what degree of certainty we really understand the nature of suicide. Do we even agree as professionals as to defining simple terms and concepts? So that was an extremely interesting presentation that I valued, and I thought it was a great ending to the conference. So I mentioned some of the most impactful moments actually happened in between sessions. At the dining tables, they had labels to try to get different groups, division members to sit together. So one of the tables said, attempt survivors lived experience. So I sat at that table each time I went for breakfast to have coffee. And not everybody paid attention to what the signs said, but typically there were other people with lived experience and attempt survivors there at the table. And one morning we were talking about lethal means safety and firearms. I think there was a group there, an individual that worked with veterans. There was another individual there doing the Mayor's Challenge, which is also focused on military and veterans. And so that's where the conversation was heading. And I mentioned, really my ignorance of guns was probably one of the things that saved me, because I simply was too afraid that I would do something wrong and be maimed, forever injured, and then have to live with those injuries. And after I shared this, the gentleman sitting next to me shared some of his story, and that was probably the most profound 60 seconds of the entire event for me. Just hearing this person share his story of getting to the point where he planned on ending his life. Since it's not my story to tell, I won't share too many details. But just spoke of the significant impact of having someone in his life saying, you need to stick around. If you ever need me, call me, and gave him his card. And that's a huge part of what ended up saving him. And then as we continued to talk, he even shared, once you were kind of telling your story, it seemed really natural for me to share mine. And I just thought how impactful his story was for me to hear that. And really how one step of sharing, one step of opening up can lead to the next, and that we can spread a culture of being more open, having a better understanding of suicide, leading many of us to live much less in the dark, much less in shame. So that was probably the most profound experience, was a matter of 60 seconds of hearing another individual's story, sharing how he did not go through with the suicide attempt and the steps that really led to saving his life. I also mentioned a party. So I am introverted by nature, social anxiety. There are many great people in Suicidology, very kind, very warm. And I got a very warm welcome and an invitation to go to a party Friday night. That can be very intimidating, especially through my history of always viewing myself as not belonging, as being an outsider, as really belonging on the fringe. Those are difficult situations for me to be in, but I accepted the offer from a very kind, generous person and had a lot of great conversations and really took away some great points. One being, as far as suicide prevention, it's really easy to second guess ourselves, or it's easy for me to second guess myself. And I do think it's important to be cautious and to be very intentional and methodical, but at the same time, suicide prevention to actually implement strategies does take a boldness. It does take courage. Although I do think boldness and courage doesn't always have to come in one act. It can gradually lead to a tipping point. That was a huge message I took away from a simple conversation I had at the party. And I got to meet a lot of great people that I would not have otherwise, and to hear some of their stories and the things that they're doing in their communities, and some even much broader as in a national and even international community, whereas my work is typically focused more locally. And that was another one of the best experiences of the conference for me, getting to sit in this cultural environment, engaging, listening, and I did have a lot of distress afterwards, and actually brought me back to moments of when I was in college, when I was in high school, and the really intense, isolating pain that I felt in similar scenarios at those times. So for instance, in those days, if I were in a party-like environment, I would try to find, if there were musical instruments somewhere, I would go off in the corner. Or, if there were a dog, I would be sitting somewhere with the pet. Or even in college, I was unsociable to the point that I had brought a book to a party, and even handheld video games, which I guess now everybody has cell phones. So that's probably like a cultural norm, although it's still somewhat frowned upon. But afterwards, I reflected and tried to take a pragmatic approach. If you don't think you have the social skills, maybe do some research, look at what are the skills you might need and practice those. And then, kind of in a sense, exposure therapy, go into different social settings, knowing that it might be uncomfortable, knowing that you might even feel like you failed at certain moments, and be accepting of that, be gentle and compassionate about that, but keep trying it. So that's a strategy that I would tell to myself. And also just really trying to change my perception that I'm just like everybody else. I'm just as important to take up space and to be there and to interact, and that I'm not lesser than. But sometimes it is really hard. What I would call the old me can kind of creep up pretty easily. So good reminders to have, and again, was a really good experience at the conference. So that wraps up some of my experiences at the AAS22 conference. And actually, this next week in Michigan, we have our statewide conference where I'll get to engage and interact and learn from suicide preventionists, suicidologists around the state. So I'll be looking forward to that.
If you like this video, comment, click subscribe, and give a like below. Take a deep breath, now let it out. Roll your shoulders back and hold your head up high.